Throughout the 16th century, the Umayyad Khalifa conquered North and West Africa almost entirely through trade and traveling merchants. Simultaneously, the Age of Exploration opened the Americas to European colonization and West Africa to European trade, resulting in the now infamous triangular trade that brought more than 10 million African slaves to American shores between 1525 and 1866. Scholars now estimate that nearly one-third of these slaves may have been Muslim. Early American slave owners and Christian evangelists created a turning point in African American history when the systematic religious and cultural conversion of African slaves during the 18th and 19th centuries led to the nearly complete erasure of Islamic culture and religion in the United States by the start of the Civil War. Although the legacy of America's Islamic slaves can still be found in some aspects of modern American culture, such as musical genres, instrument designs, and dancing styles, the systematic erasure of Islam cultural and religious identity in colonial and antebellum America has led to an exclusively race-based modern narrative of the African American experience, one which excludes a competing origin story of a rich Islamic religious and cultural heritage that may have been shared by nearly one-third of all African slaves. In the loss of this story, we have lost a vital part of both African American and religious history in the United States. Today's modern narrative of the American slave trade is almost universally framed by race. From Frederick Douglass's narrative of a slave to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin to Alex Haley's Roots and Toni Morrison's Beloved, the narrative is framed in black and white, a racial divide. Even the New York Times seminal 1619 Project, which aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative, frames the American story of slavery as one exclusively of race. But the reasons that historians frame slavery as a story of race is because we have lost the other story, the story of religion, the Islamic heritage that nearly one-third of all slaves shared. Modern ideology, race-based master narratives, and scarce evidence documenting the lives of Muslim slaves continue to lead Americans to believe that Christianity was the only significant monotheistic religion in colonial America, and that slaves followed only African tribal religions or came from rudimentary societies. Lost is the story of the great Islamic urban centers in Africa from which many slaves came, rich with thriving educational, social, legal, and political institutions. It is this heritage which came to the Americas on the backs of our Islamic slaves. Muslim merchants took over the African continent as early as the 1500s. Slowly and steadily, the numbers of African Muslims increased as trade with Middle Eastern Muslims grew. Soon after, the Islamic Khalifa officially took over the northern and western expanse of Africa. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, created by a worldwide multidisciplinary team over nearly 20 years, contains the records of more than 30,000 slave ship voyages to and from every major slaving port in the world. According to these records, more than 12.5 million Africans were enslaved and shipped to the New World between 1550 and 1866, more than 500,000 of whom disembarked in the mainland North America. According to Dr. Michael Gomez, director of the New York University Center for Study of Africa, most of the principal regions of Africa from which these Africans originated were either wholly or partially under Islamic control or influence. At a minimum, Gomez estimates that at least 200,000 African slaves came from Islamic regions, indicating that Muslims were transported to the Americas by the tens of thousands. The presence of Islam among Africans is most easily seen through syncretism between native African practices and traditions and the new Islamic religion. Some traditions within native African religions were blended with the Islamic tradition, such as the amulets many Africans routinely wore for protection. After the spread of Islam, these amulets were adapted to contain Quranic verses. Along with the dissemination of the Islamic religions, Muslim schools began to appear around Africa, which led to wider education among all social classes. Historians see these centers for Islamic schooling as an important contributor to literacy among Muslim slaves. Although scholars estimate that one-third of all slaves sent over in the first waves were Muslim, little documentary evidence of their presence in the Americas remains today. Islamic presence in both colonial and antebellum America remains difficult to detect because the slave owners changed the names of their slaves upon arrival to the colonies. Although some scarce examples of Islamic slave names may be found in colonial runaway slave posters, the largest body of evidence lies in the ledgers of slave ships intercepted by British privateers which contain many original names of slaves prior to their sale. Because the slaves on intercepted ships were generally held in slave free areas of the British West Indies, the names of these slaves remained intact and serve as evidence for the number of Islamic slaves typically aboard any given slave ship bound to the Americas. However, all other documentation suggests that colonial slave owners routinely altered the names of their slaves upon sale. Dr. Henry Gates Jr., professor and founding director of Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University, notes that slaves were also routinely assigned the surnames of their owners, as evidenced by the U.S. Census records in the 1800s. By masking the names of Islamic slaves and thus their linguistic and religious identity, slave owners also masked the multicultural background from which their slaves originated. It is a common misconception that slaves came primarily from the ranks of prisoners of conflicts in Africa, when in fact people of nobility and high status were also kidnapped and brought to colonial America as slaves. Because they were high status, they were often educated and able to leave behind documentation of their experience in colonial America. It is through these writings that evidence of early Muslim heritage is predominantly found in colonial America. The most prominent example of this was Ayuba Sulaiman Diallo, a slave of high status in colonial America who was once a merchant in Africa. He worked for the English government to escape a life of slavery and eventually found a way to get back to Africa. His narrative, published by the English government, is one of the 5 existing writings about slave life created by a Muslim slave. Although thousands of all African slaves in colonial America were Muslim, only a handful of literate, well-educated Islamic slaves were able to leave behind any substantial evidence of their existence. Although little documentary evidence of Muslim practices among slaves are recorded by white slave owners, there is one notable exception, Charles Ball, who in 1837 wrote, "I know several people who must have been, from what I have since learned, Mohammedans, Muslims. Though at the time I had never heard of the religion of Muhammad, there was one man on this plantation who prayed 5 times every day, always turning his face to the east when in performance of his devotion." However, much of the Islamic origin of early slaves is obscured due to the practice of forced conversion in much of colonial America.
The resources are hard to find, and that's because we're talking about people who were enslaved, and so they were treated like they were livestock. And so, there were laws which, for example, made it illegal for them to read or write. And so the fact that we have any written records written by some of these slaves at all and that they survived is really miraculous, really.
In fact, many slaves were converted to Christianity. The most famous example of this was Umar ibn Sayyid, who wrote his own autobiography. Despite the outward appearance of having changed religions, he wrote several documents in Arabic near the end of his life concerning Quranic scriptures in Arabic, without the knowledge of his owners. Although some Muslim slaves may have been converted voluntarily, many were converted by force. During the 1700s, the Baptist Church was notorious for its forced conversion of slaves in what they claimed was their duty. They believed that the slaves were uncivilized and in need of their guidance. Despite the obvious oppression efforts to take away religious and cultural identity from the Muslims, their impact can still be found in today's American culture. While few overtly practiced the Islamic religion by the time slavery was abolished in 1866, some retained key characteristics that form culture today. These practices included wearing head coverings and the observance of celebrations that once originated from Islam, such as sadaqah, meaning almsgiving. Some slaves recall saying words like Amin, which also originate from Islam's ritual prayer before eating. Slave families adopted foods such as honey cakes, which came from the Islamic culture, or observed Islamic dietary restrictions, such as abstaining from drinking alcohol. Even the beads found in some plantations could be linked to the Islamic sibha. However, Islamic music traditions may have had the most profound impact on Black American culture today. For example, the blues music genre is thought to have come from Islam through the adhan, the Islamic call from prayer. In fact, scholars have even traced some early instrument design to Islamic instruments that spread to Africa.
Music was something used in West Africa to preserve history and preserve knowledge, and undoubtedly that tradition was carried over across the Atlantic as well.
In the end, this narrative is most important to know because it begs the question, would Islam be viewed the same by modern Americans had those early and peaceful Muslim practices not been erased so early on in America's history? Instead of creating a culture of religious diversity in which the world's 2 largest monotheistic religions coexist and thrive, the origin story of Islam and African American culture vanishes due to the deliberate cultural oppression efforts of slave owners because of the nature of American society at the time. That is all despite the fact that 1/3 of all slaves who came to the Americas were of Muslim origin. This obscure story has changed and continues to change the lives of billions of people across the globe.